She thought it was just an abandoned car in the woods, but what she found inside turned her quiet life into a fight for truth that could shake the entire country. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The morning mist rolled through Coyote Ridge like a slow breath, soft and heavy, settling over rust-colored canyons and forgotten railway lines. The town, little more than a cluster of weather-beaten buildings and crooked power poles, was the kind of place people passed through but rarely stopped. It was exactly why Willa Sinclair had chosen it. After the accident that had claimed her husband's life 12 years ago, a factory collapse that had turned a normal Tuesday into a lifetime of silence. She'd needed somewhere quiet, somewhere the world wouldn't demand anything from her. Here, tucked away behind a modest auto shop on the edge of town, Willa had rebuilt her life one engine, one stripped bolt, one piece of steel at a time. At 42, Willa wasn't what most imagined when they pictured a mechanic. She was small but strong, wiry from years of physical labor, her hands forever stained with grease that no soap could scrub away. A faded trucker cap kept her chestnut hair out of her face, and her overalls bore the marks of countless repairs: oil, soot, rust, and memory. She lived alone except for Max, her golden retriever, who followed her everywhere and seemed to understand the weight she carried. Together, they'd carved out a rhythm. Coffee at dawn, radio crackling in the background, a few hours spent tinkering on classic cars people had long given up on. Willa found comfort in bringing things back to life, things that others thought were beyond saving. But on this particular morning, nothing felt routine. As she stood outside the garage, sipping black coffee from her chipped mug, the one that said "Torque Queen" in peel-in red letters, a strange gust swept through the lot. It carried with it the scent of dry earth and something else, something metallic and old. Max's ears perked, and he lifted his head, nose twitching. "What is it, boy?" Willa asked, lowering her mug. The dog didn't answer, of course, but he started trotting toward the back fence, tail low, movements alert. Willa frowned. Beyond that fence lay nothing but scrub brush and pine, and an overgrown trail that led to a section of abandoned railroad no one had touched in decades. She hadn't walked that path herself since moving here. There had been no reason to, but today something pulled at her. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper she didn't have a name for. She set her mug down, wiped her hands on a rag, and followed Max through the fence. The trail wound through dense trees, roots coiled like knotted ropes underfoot. It wasn't a long hike, but the climb reminded Willa that she was no longer 20. Still, she pressed on, her boots crunching over old gravel until the trees opened into a small clearing, and there she stopped dead in her tracks. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but no, there it was. A car. Not just any car. A 1967 Shelby GT 500. Its once deep emerald paint faded to a ghost of itself, its chrome dulled and pitted but still regal. It sat half buried in weeds, the driver's side door hanging slightly ajar like an open mouth frozen mid-scream. Willa's heart thudded. Cars like this didn't just appear in the middle of the woods. Every inch of her mechanic's instinct screamed that something wasn't right. And yet, she felt drawn closer, as if the car itself was calling to her. She approached slowly, fingertips grazing the hood. The metal was warm under the morning sun, and for a fleeting second, it felt like the car was whispering stories it wasn't ready to tell. Max sniffed around the tires, then whimpered and backed away, hackles raised. "Easy, boy," Willa murmured, but her stomach tightened. She reached for the door handle. It creaked as it opened, protesting as though reluctant to give up its secrets. The interior smelled musty and stale, like time itself had been trapped inside. Cracked leather seats, a dashboard layered with dust, a half-finished soda can in the cup holder, a pair of sunglasses on the dash, like someone had just stepped away and never come back. Then she saw it. In the back seat, nestled carefully in the shadows, was a small wooden box. It was hand-carved, the surface etched with delicate patterns of mountains and pine trees, far too intricate to be something forgotten. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it. It was heavier than it looked. Willa sat in the driver's seat and opened the lid. The breath left her body as if someone had punched her in the chest. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each one sealed in a yellowed envelope, bound together with fraying twine. On top of the stack lay a black and white photograph. A man in a soldier's uniform, smiling as he spun a laughing woman in a field of tall grass. They looked timeless, alive. Her fingers brushed the photo as though it were sacred. She picked up the first envelope and read the name written in careful, lupin handwriting. To Anna. My only reason. James. Willa swallowed hard and read the first letter aloud, voice barely a whisper. My dearest Anna. If you're reading this, it means I never made it back. But please know that you were the best part of me. Every day in that desert, I held on to your laugh. I swore I'd come home and fix the Shelby for you, painted that green you always loved. If I failed, I want you to keep her. She's yours, just like I always was. Her eyes burned. She hadn't meant to cry, but tears slid down her cheeks. Slow, uninvited, unstoppable. Max rested his head on her knee, sensing her change in mood. This wasn't just a car, it was a monument, a love letter, a grave wrapped in steel. Willa spent hours there reading letter after letter, piecing together a story written decades before her time. James had gone to war. He had promised to return, and he never did. The woman, Anna, had likely brought the car here, unable to part with it but unable to bear the memories it carried. Perhaps this was her way of burying the past without a headstone. As the sun dipped lower, Willa checked the glove compartment. Inside were more letters, old receipts from a gas station dated 2003, and a photo of Anna, older now, standing beside a folded American flag. Willa's chest tightened. The man was gone. The woman, too, most likely. And yet, here they were. Their story sealed in this forgotten machine, waiting for someone to find it. Standing beside the Shelby, the last light of day painting the clearing in gold, Willa felt a quiet resolve settle into her bones. The car was broken. Seized engine, rotted transmission, rust chewing through its frame, but she had rebuilt worse. Maybe this wasn't about restoring an old machine. Maybe it was about finishing a story that had never truly ended. And for the first time in 12 long years, Willa Sinclair felt like she was meant to do something more than just fix what was broken. She was meant to uncover what had been buried. The Shelby slept in the center bay like a relic rescued from a cathedral, its battered emerald skin catching the last slants of afternoon sun that leaked through the shop's high windows. Willa rolled the door down and threw the deadbolt, more out of instinct than fear. The box of letters sat on her workbench beneath the fluorescent hum, their edges feathered with age, their twine denting the paper like a memory refusing to let go. She told herself she'd inventory them later, scan, date, arrange, but the car tugged at her first. Machines always had a way of asking to be heard. She popped the trunk latch. Nothing. The lever stuck like it had fused to time. Willa fetched a can of lubricant, worked the mechanism, and levered her screwdriver under the lip. Metal groaned, a long, reluctant exhale, before the trunk finally gave. At first, she saw the ordinary detritus of a life interrupted. A wool blanket, a brittle road atlas stained with coffee rings, an empty oil can, the sun-bleached sleeve of an old army jacket. Then her gaze snagged on a squat rectangle pressed deep against the rear bulkhead, almost disguised by the blanket's fold. A lockbox. Steel, old, utilitarian, no keyhole, just a scuffed combination dial that had outlived its instructions. Her pulse tripped. Letters were one thing, secrets locked in steel were another. Willa lifted the box onto the bench. The weight anchored her hands, a gravity that felt moral as much as physical. She wiped the dust from the dial, studying the scratches around the numbers, the way certain digits bore a history of use. Too many possibilities. She looked back at the letters, names, dates, the photograph of Anna in a sunlit field, a promise to paint the Shelby a particular green, and, on an envelope from the middle of the stack, a date underlined twice, June 10th, 1993. She steadied her breath and spun the dial. Right to 10, left to 6, right to 19, left to 93. No, that wasn't how this vintage worked. 3 numbers only. She chewed her lower lip, recalibrated. 6, 10, 93. The dial resisted, then clicked with a small, decisive sound that shot through her like electricity. Inside lay a row of compact cassette tapes, their labels written in tight, deliberate block letters that had not shaken yet. Night Recon 12-03. Campfire Briefing. Photo, final report, do not share. Beneath them, a smaller foam cutout held a cheap USB thumb drive, the kind you buy by the handful and lose by the dozen. Someone had taped a sliver of paper to it. 2 words, to be heard. Willa's throat tightened. Letters could be dismissed as sentiment. Audio, dates, labels, these were spines of fact. She set the tapes aside like sleeping bones and turned the drive over in her palm. "What did you carry, James?" she whispered. Max stirred under the desk, let out a soft huff, and went still again. The garage settled into its evening lull, fluorescents buzzing, a cooling tick in a distant pipe, the slow breath of wind dragging tumbleweed across asphalt. She killed the radio. She didn't want anyone on a passing frequency to hear what she was about to learn, even if that someone was no one at all. She reached for her shop laptop, old, dented but clean, scrubbed of personal logins after long-ago lessons, and slid the USB into a side port. Nothing auto-launched. Good. She opened the drive manually. A directory appeared, /audio/docs/index. In /docs, she found scanned memos with redacted blocks like eyelids, field notes in a different handwriting, schematic diagrams that looked disturbingly like someone's idea of a simple solution to a complex problem. In /audio, more labels that matched the tapes in the box. She clicked the one titled Campfire Briefing, Photo. Static. A cough, then a voice. Male, mid-30s, the tone of someone who'd learned to ration emotion the way you ration water. Record on. Perimeter 60 yards, no light beyond reflective. 2 civilians confirmed. Child, 8, 9, female. Everything we were told is wrong. A pause, the scrap of a match. Directive came down this morning from off-channel, no signature. We were to retrieve, not engage. I repeat, retrieve, not engage. The rest is in the photo. If this is found, I want it known I objected. The voice steadied on the last words, as if willing the tape to carry its spine. The shop's hum thickened. Willa stopped the file and sat very still. Somewhere outside, a semi growled along the highway and faded. She scrubbed her face with her hands. It felt like she'd leaned into a wind that hadn't decided whether to chill or burn. She clicked another file. Final report, do not share. Unauthorized deployment, the voice said, quieter now, as if the air itself could be listening. collateral miscounted as combatants. We were told to forget. We were told to bury. I'm leaving proof in the vehicle. Anna, if you ever hear this—" Willa flinched and snatched her finger from the trackpad as if the sound had bitten her. She stared at the black screen, at her reflection split by the hinge. That name again. A man organizing his courage into careful stacks. A promise hidden in steel. A truth someone had tried to keep from daylight. She ejected the drive, powered down the laptop, and slipped the USB into the watch pocket of her jeans. Her father had drilled one thing into her when she'd been too young to understand why it mattered. If you carry something that can't be replaced, you carry it on you. The shop's wall clock clacked to 11:42. She told herself to go home, to sleep for an hour, 2. Instead, she prowled the Shelby with a flashlight. Under the seats, behind panels, along the seam where the trunk floor met the wheel wells. Rust had gnawed the lip, but a section sounded hollower than the rest. She pried the seam open with a gasket scraper until a thin plate shifted free. Behind it, taped to the fuel tank with the stubbornness of a dying idea, was another cassette. Label, for Anna, final message. She held it like it might crumble under the shape of her palm. The night outside reset, the wind fell off, the highway silenced. A hush, thick as wool, dropped over the shop, and in that hush, Willa heard something that didn't belong. The soft grind of tires on gravel where no one should be at this hour. Max woke. He didn't bark. He stood, hackles high, his body as still and taut as a bow strung to its limit. Headlights ghosted along the gap under the roll-up door, brief, dim, then gone. A door latch clicked. 2 sets of footsteps negotiated the front stoop. The shop's outer handle whispered against metal. The lock turned, not forced, unlocked. She hadn't forgotten the bolt. She knew she hadn't. The wrongness slid over her shoulders like cold water. Willa moved without thinking. She palmed the lockbox into the shadow between a tool chest and the wall, tucked the cassette inside her shirt, and pointed Max to the corner with a flat hand. "Stay," he held. The front door eased open. Flashlight beams knifed through the dark and played across the concrete, then climbed the shelves in greedy strides. One beam paused on the Shelby. The other cut to the office where her breaker panel hid behind a corkboard studded with work orders and jokes she'd stopped hearing as funny. "Keep it quiet," a low voice said. It had the clipped patience of a man used to being obeyed. "Sheriff wants clean, no damage." "Should have done this last week," another voice answered. Gravelly, older, the complaint of a man who'd learned to hide fear by sanding it down to irritation. "He thinks the woman's got it." Willa's skin prickled, every hair a barometer. The words sheriff and clean did not belong in her shop at midnight. She eased along the shadow of the workbenches to the office door. If she could kill the power, it would buy her seconds. Seconds were miles if you used them right. She found the breaker with her fingertips and snapped it. Darkness smashed the fluorescence out of existence. The flashlights went instantly brighter and more frantic, jittering over metal, throwing teethy shadows from wrenches and lift arms. "She's in here," the clipped voice said, sharper now. "Fan out." Max moved a half step. Willa's palm found his ribs. Hold. She tossed a socket wrench into the far bay. It detonated against a rolling cart and set off a chain of metallic shock, drawers rattling, a cascade of loose bolts skittering like hail. Both beams whipped toward the noise. Willa slid past the office threshold, keeping low, using the line of the benches, the geometry of familiarity, to erase her shape from their angles. The side door's bar handle waited 10 feet away. 10 feet is a lifetime if someone's scared and you're patient. She breathed once, steady and slow, then slipped out into the alley, pulling the door soft behind her. Cold air slapped her lungs. The smell of sage and dust and last summer's gasoline washed over her like clarity. Behind her, boots crunched, the side door rattled. One of the men hit the handle and swore. Locked from the inside. Willa cut through the narrow run behind the shop and slid between a stack of old tires and the fence. She crouched, phone in hand, thumb on the screen. No bars, of course. Coyote Ridge held cell service the way it held confessions, sparingly, only in daylight, only if you stood in exactly the right spot and asked politely. The USB's shape pressed against her hip like a brand. The cassette under her shirt stayed still, unburned by her frantic heartbeat only because it had no blood to answer fear with. She pictured the letters on her workbench, the photograph of the man in uniform with the laugh in his eyes, and felt something in her ribcage lock into place. If you run now, this dies here. She waited, counted, listened. The men moved with a quiet competence that told her they'd done this before. The clipped voice kept issuing small orders. Check the pit, pop the dash, pry the panels, until Willa could map their positions by sound. When their beams swung to the back bay again, she ghosted along the fence, kept to the darkness, and slipped across the lot to the gravel lane that bled into the road. Max padded at her heel, a silent shadow. Together, they moved through Coyote Ridge the way you move through a house you once loved, remembering each loose board and cracking step and the exact distance from porch to gate. When they reached the dark square of the pawn shop wedged between the laundromat and the shuttered diner, Willa pounded on the back door with the urgency of someone who had finally decided not to be quiet. It took long seconds before the porch light clicked on, and Charlie Maddox croaked through the wood. "Willa Sinclair, if this is about haggling me to death over that inoperable compressor again—" "Charlie," she said, breath biting, "I need your eyes. Now." The deadbolt slid. The door opened on a wedge of yellow light and a man who looked like all the years he'd lived and none of the ones he'd wanted. Late 60s, shoulders stooped from carrying more radios than regrets, hair like steel wool. A hearing aid he never cleaned because he said it gave him an excuse not to listen to idiots. He saw her face, then the way Max hovered tight to her thigh, and he skipped the preamble. Inside, Charlie's back room smelled like dust and solder. Radios sat in regiments on metal shelves, their knobs missing, their cases quarter open like autopsies. A battered laptop older than some of Willa's wrenches perched on a desk, its screen held by 2 strips of gaffer's tape. Charlie planted himself in the chair, spat a sunflower seed husk into a coffee tin, and held out his palm. "What'd you bring me that looks like trouble?" Willa placed the USB there. It looked too small to justify the freight of her fear. Charlie turned it under the light, sniffed. "Cheap. Good. Cheap means replaceable. Replaceable means common. Common means no one remembers where it came from." He slotted it in. He navigated like a man who'd built radios from scratch before people decided the air should be a vending machine for comfort. Directories bloomed. He grunted when he saw /audio. He clicked campfire briefing, photo, and hunched forward. They listened to the voice lay out facts like stones across a river you cross in the dark. They listened to the match flare, to the scrub of a sleeve across a microphone, to the carefully placed word objected. When Charlie stopped the file, his jaw worked around nothing. "Jesus, Willa," he said, soft and flat, the way you say a thing you don't want to admit you believe. "Where?" "In a Shelby," she said, "in the trees behind the rail spur." Charlie leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, lips thin. Somebody hid this where only the right kind of person would find it. Or where no one ever would. He clicked another file. Final report, Do not share." The room cooled with the voice. Charlie didn't look at her while it played. He stared at the wall like the words might come through the paint and pin him there. When the recording reached the name, Anna, Willa swallowed and looked away. "Who else knows?" he asked when it ended. "2 men at my shop," she said. "They moved like they trained for it. They talked about the sheriff like he didn't need to be named." "Which sheriff?" Charlie asked, but he didn't wait for the answer. "Doesn't matter. Out here, the badge is a door, not a lock. If it came from him, it came from someone whispering in his ear while he held the phone for photographs." He pushed the laptop away and folded his fingers atop his belly. "You can't keep this. Not because you're not brave enough, because you're not stupid. I'm not giving it to them." "Good," he said. "Then we give it to someone who can't be leaned on with a promise of a better parade route." He jabbed a finger at the drive. "You know Maya Hartley?" "The Tribune reporter." Willa nodded. "She took down a water contamination cover-up last spring, cost a senator his seat." "She didn't take it down," Charlie said. "She gave the public the shovel and the map." He sniffed. "She's got a stringer out this way. A man who used to patch comms for wildland crews before the companies decided firefighters should come with stock options. He owes me 2 favors and 1 apology." Charlie opened a dented steel cash box, not for money, but for a tangle of cokes and a frequency list, handwritten so small it looked like a confession. He pulled a card free and slid it to her. 3 Pines Ridge. Go quiet. Go now. He'll put it in the air in a way no one can conveniently misplace. Willa glanced at the clock. 12:31. The men at her shop would be patient. Patient men are worse than angry ones. "They'll come back," she said. "They always do," Charlie agreed. Then he looked up, and for a moment she saw the version of him that had once sat in a different chair, with headphones crimping his hair and a war he didn't want to belong to thudding through his ribs. "You're not just carrying paper, Willa. You're carrying a story that doesn't belong to you, and somehow belongs to you more than anything else you've held since you buried Ben." The name punched air out of her. She hadn't said her husband's name out loud in months. It looked different in Charlie's mouth, less like a stone, more like a hand on her shoulder telling her she wasn't crazy to feel the room tilt. He lowered his voice. "This is where they try to scare you back into silence. It's the only part of the playbook that's never changed." She slid the USB from the laptop and tucked it into a tiny pocket sewn inside her waistband, the one she'd added years ago for cash on long supply runs. She handed Charlie the original cassette, the one marked for Anna, final message. "If I don't make it back—" "You'll make it back," he said, but he took the cassette with a gentleness that looked like prayer. "And if you don't, I'll make sure someone hears what you carried." They moved fast then. Charlie assembled a radio package, frequencies, a hand-drawn map, a list of call and response codes, simple enough for a sleep-deprived mind to remember, while Willa texted no one, because there was no one she trusted who wouldn't be endangered by receiving it. She grabbed a revolver from the top shelf of his safe because he offered, and because refusing would have been a kind of pride she couldn't afford. At the door, Charlie hesitated. "You got a clean tail?" "Best I could." "Then make it cleaner." Outside, the night had thawed a degree, as if it had decided to let her pass. Willa climbed into her old Chevy, starter catching on the second try the way it always had since she'd rebushed the solenoid last winter, and Max leapt into the passenger seat like a soldier grateful to be given orders at last. She eased onto the empty street, killed her headlights for the first quarter-mile, then slid them back on at low beam. Coyote Ridge unspooled around her, The laundromat's flicker, the diner's neon open sign still blinking out of habit, the grain elevator bulked like a ship in dry dock. She took the back road east, where the pavement forgot itself and gave up to washboard dirt. The mountains rose ahead like the edge of a page turned halfway. In the rear view, no lights followed. Either the men had decided she'd fled the other way, or they were confident enough to wait for morning and a polite knock. She drove until the town fell off the map, and the road narrowed into a two-lane no one paved because no one had lobbied for it. A sign for 3 Pines Ridge loomed out of the dark, riddled with bullet holes that looked like punctuation marks left by someone who hated full stops. When she finally pulled onto a turnout hemmed by lodgepole pine, the world felt sharpened, expectant. She cut the engine. Silence poured in. No semis, no night trains, just the bristle of needles gossiping with the wind and Max's slow, deliberate breath. Willa rested her forehead against the steering wheel and let her heartbeat find a rhythm that wouldn't get her killed. She pictured the men in her shop tracing her steps through the dust, the sheriff's name said like a password, the letters under the fluorescent hum, the label on the cassette. She pictured the woman in the photograph, Anna, laughing at a joke only love understands. And she pictured Ben's hands, the last time they'd brushed hers in the doorway of the life that had collapsed around her like scaffolding pulled too soon. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." She lifted her head. The ridge waited, dark and real and no more dangerous than truth. Somewhere up there, a radio tech with a debt and an apology would wake to a knock he'd always known would come. Somewhere behind her, men practiced at the art of erasing would make a plan for daylight. Between those points, a woman who fixed broken things and a dog who trusted her. She found the trailhead with her flashlight hooded by her palm, then killed the light and let her eyes learn the dark. Max padded ahead, nose low, tail quiet. The path climbed, steep enough to demand focus, narrow enough to forbid doubt. The air thinned. The stars brightened. In the east, the first hint of gray admitted that the night would not last forever. By the time she saw the sagging outline of a cabin shouldered into rock and shadow, the ridge had chewed the worst of her fear into something leaner and more precise. She raised her knuckles to the door and tapped 3 times, the way Charlie had told her to do. A pause, a scrape. The door opened on a man with a beard like winter scrub and eyes that measured without malice. "Red?" Willa asked. "Depends who's asking," he said. "The favor's from Charlie," she answered, and held up the USB between finger and thumb so he could see the shape of the thing that had already changed both of their nights. He stepped aside. The interior glowed in the red dim of instrument lights. An antenna rig, ugly and beautiful, tilted in the corner like a question mark pulled straight. Cokes snaked across the floor. A folding chair waited by a battered desk. "Let's get it sent," Red said. Willa exhaled. The ridge breathed back. Max settled at her heel. And far below, in a sleepy town that preferred its silences neat, 2 men would be discovering that the woman they had come to frighten had walked deeper into the dark, carrying a voice that refused to stay buried. The road to 3 Pines Ridge was more memory than pavement, a twisting, half-forgotten scar carved into the Colorado backcountry. Willa's old Chevy rattled over the uneven ground, its headlights cut in narrow tunnels through the darkness. Max sat upright in the passenger seat, ears perked and eyes scanning the forest beyond the glass. Every bend felt like a decision, every mile a point of no return. It had been less than 24 hours since the break-in at her garage, and yet everything in Willa's life had shifted. Yesterday, her world had been a handful of engines and quiet evenings. Today, it was secrets buried by the military, men with guns hunting for them, and a thumb drive in her pocket that could unravel decades of lies. And through it all, one thought pulsed beneath the fear. She had to see this through. Charlie's words replayed in her head as the truck climbed higher into the hills. This isn't just evidence. It's a story someone died trying to tell. By dawn, the forest swallowed the road entirely. Willa parked the truck beneath a canopy of pines, grabbed her pack, and slung the revolver across her back. Max jumped down beside her, tail low but steady. Together, they moved silently along the narrow trail Charlie had marked on the map. The silence of the woods was deceptive, beautiful, serene, but tense like the pause before a storm. They hiked for hours, stopping only when Max froze mid-step, his body rigid, his gaze fixed ahead. Willa crouched low, following his line of sight, a faint glint of metal through the trees. A car, a black, newer model, parked half hidden off the trail. It hadn't been there long. Her pulse quickened. They had followed her. She backed away slowly, careful not to snap a twig or rustle a leaf. Whoever they were close, maybe even watching. She had two choices: turn back and run, or keep moving deeper into the ridge and hope she could lose them. She chose forward. By mid-afternoon, the trail narrowed into a steep incline, and through the trees she finally saw it. The cabin Charlie had told her about. A small wooden structure, half collapsed under the weight of time, with a rusted antenna jutting from its roof like a sentinel. A faded sign nailed to a tree read, "Private property, keep out." "Looks like we found the place," Willa whispered. Max gave a soft huff in reply. As they approached, the cabin door creaked open and a man stepped into the light. He was tall and wiry, his face weathered by years of mountain air and hard living. His eyes were sharp, though, the kind that measured people before deciding if they were worth speaking to. "Red?" Willa asked. "Depends who's asking," he replied. "Charlie sent me." She held up the USB drive between two fingers. "I need this broadcasted." For a long moment, the man didn't move. Then he nodded once and stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, the cabin was a chaos of radio parts, soldering tools, and half-assembled transmitters. Maps of signal ranges covered the walls, marked with notes and coordinates. At the center of it all sat a battered transceiver, ancient but still humming with life. "Put it here," Red said, gesturing to a small console. "I'll patch it through." Willa handed over the drive and exhaled for the first time in hours. "It's all on there. Audio files, scanned documents, memos, everything James left behind." "James Whitmore?" Red asked, glancing at her. "You knew him?" Red paused, hands hovering over the controls. "Everyone in my line of work knew him. He was the one who tried to blow the whistle on Thunder Vale 20 years ago. They said he vanished." "He didn't vanish," Willa said quietly. "He was silenced." Red's eyes met hers. "And now you're the one carrying his voice." It took nearly 2 hours to patch the signal and prepare the transmission. Red worked in silence, fingers flying across the dials and switches with practiced ease. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the console lights flared green. "It's ready," he said. "Once I press this, there's no taking it back." "Do it." He pressed the button. A low hum filled the cabin as data began to flow through the airwaves. James's files, his recordings, his truth, all racing toward a secure server linked to the Denver Tribune. It was the moment Willa had been working toward since she found the Shelby in the woods. Yet, instead of relief, a deep, uneasy calm settled over her. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. "Now we wait," Red said, leaning back in his chair. "If Hartley's still got people listening, they'll pick this up within the hour." Willa walked outside and stood at the edge of the clearing. The forest stretched endlessly before her, golden light filtering through the trees. Max lay at her feet, head on his paws, his breathing slow and steady. For the first time in days, she felt something resembling hope. But hope was fragile, and it shattered the moment she heard the distant growl of an engine. Willa froze. Two black SUVs appeared on the far side of the clearing, their tinted windows catching the dying light. Doors opened. Men in tactical gear spilled out, rifles slung across their chests. "They found us," she whispered. Red stepped outside, his face grim. "Transmission's already in the air. They can't stop it now." "They can stop us," Willa said, backing toward the cabin. The men moved quickly, fanning out through the trees. Whoever they weren't amateurs. They had training, military, federal, or worse. One of them raised a hand and shouted, "Willa Sinclair, step away from the building." Willa's heart slammed against her ribs. They knew her name. Red grabbed a battered revolver from a drawer and tossed it to her. "If they want to silence this story, they'll have to go through us." She checked the chamber. 4 rounds. Not much, but more than nothing. "You any good with that thing?" "Better than I look." They took positions. Willa crouched behind an overturned workbench near the door, Red by the side window with a clear view of the clearing. Max stayed low, growling softly. The sun had nearly set, shadows deepening as the men closed in. "Final warning," one of them shouted. "Surrender the evidence now." "Too late," Willa muttered. "It's already gone." The first shot cracked through the stillness, splintering wood inches from Willa's shoulder. She ducked lower, adrenaline flooding her veins. Another shot, then another. Red returned fire, forcing 2 of them to dive for cover. The forest erupted into chaos. Gunfire, shouted commands, the sharp bark of Max as he lunged toward a man trying to flank the cabin. Willa fired once, the recoil biting into her palm. One of the men dropped his rifle and stumbled back. Another tried to circle wide, but Red caught him with a shot that sent him sprawling. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the gunfire stopped. "Hold," a voice commanded. Silence fell. From behind a tree, a man stepped forward, tall, clean-cut, his tactical vest marked with an insignia Willa didn't recognize. He wasn't holding a weapon. Instead, he raised a hand in a mock salute. "You think this changes anything?" he called out. "Do you have any idea how deep this goes?" Willa's grip tightened on the revolver. "Deep enough that you're scared." The man smiled faintly. "You've made powerful enemies today." "Then they should have buried their lies deeper," she shot back. He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked away. One by one, the others followed, disappearing into the tree line as quietly as they'd come. Red exhaled slowly. "They're not done." "I know," Willa said, lowering the gun, "but neither am I." The transmission had been sent. The truth was out, and though the night around them was still and silent, Willa knew the storm was coming. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced down the darkness, and now she was ready to bring it into the light. The cabin was eerily silent after the confrontation. The men had vanished into the forest as if swallowed by the dark, leaving behind only trampled pine needles and the metallic tang of gunpowder in the air. But Willa knew better than to think it was over. If anything, their retreat meant something worse. They weren't gone. They were watching, waiting. Inside, the last transmission light on Red's battered radio console blinked faintly, signaling success. The files were gone, scattered into the ether beyond their reach. Somewhere, a journalist in Denver was now opening James Whitmore's words for the first time in 2 decades. And yet, Willa felt no relief. Only a strange, heavy quiet. She sat by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers, the revolver still within reach. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her boots, ears twitching at every creak in the wood. Red paced the small room, checking his equipment, muttering to himself as if speaking aloud would ward off the fear he refused to admit. "Signal's clean," he said eventually. "Hartley's people will have the files by now." "Good," Willa whispered, though her voice betrayed the exhaustion in her bones. "Then James's story won't die here." Red looked at her, his expression softening. "That's not just his story anymore, you know? You're part of it now." She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes drifted to her backpack, to the cassette tape she'd carried with her all this way but never dared to play. The label was simple, handwritten in careful block letters, "For Anna, final message." For hours she had avoided it, terrified of what it might contain. But now, with the storm closing in around her and the truth already released, there was nothing left to fear. Only one last piece of the puzzle to face. She stood, walked to the corner table where an old tape player sat beneath a pile of spare parts, and brushed the dust from its surface. Her fingers trembled as she slid the cassette in and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, a voice, tired, worn, but steady, filled the room. "Anna, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it home. I'm sorry. I tried. God knows I tried." Willa's breath caught. The voice was human, heartbreakingly human. This wasn't the voice of a soldier in the field or an officer issuing a report. It was the voice of a man speaking to the woman he loved one last time. "There's a weight to the truth," James continued, "not just in carrying it, but in knowing that once you share it, you can never put it down again. They told me to forget what I saw, to stay quiet. But I can't. Not when I still see the little girl from that village every time I close my eyes. Not when I hear her mother screaming." Willa pressed a hand to her mouth, her chest tight. Tears burned behind her eyes. Not just for James and Anna, but for everything this story represented. For the lives lost. For the truth buried under layers of lies. "If I never see your face again," the recording went on, voice cracking now, "just promise me one thing. Don't bury this car. Don't let them silence me. Let someone find it." The tape clicked softly as it ended, but the words lingered, echoing through the small cabin and through Willa's soul. She sat there in silence, the weight of James's final plea settling over her like a shroud. It wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about honoring a man who had risked everything to speak the truth. It was about carrying his voice, and, in a way, her own. Because in James's words, she heard something deeply personal. She heard the echo of a pain she had buried long ago, the day the factory collapsed and took Ben from her. There had been no last message then, no goodbye. Just silence and debris, and a future she didn't know how to live. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the realization struck her like a blow. She had been living like that car, abandoned, rusting, forgotten. And now, standing in the wreckage of someone else's story, she finally understood how to say goodbye to her own. Later that night, Willa built a small fire just beyond the cabin, the flames flickering against the cold mountain air. She placed 2 items into the blaze: the final letter James had written to Anna, now copied and archived for history, and one of Ben's old flannel shirts, the one she had kept tucked away in a box for over a decade. She whispered their names into the smoke, "James, Ben," and watched as the flames carried them into the night sky. It felt like releasing a breath she'd been holding for 12 long years. When the fire burned down to embers, she sat beside Max beneath a blanket of stars, so thick they seemed almost close enough to touch. The forest was silent again, but this time it was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a storm. The next morning, Willa and Red packed up the cabin. It was time to leave. The truth was out there now, unstoppable and irreversible. But even as they prepared to go, a gnawing question remained. What would happen next? "They'll come after us again," Red said as he had strapped the radio gear into a battered duffel. "Let them," Willa replied. Her voice was calm now, stronger. "They're chasing ghosts, the story's already out of their hands." They drove back toward Coyote Ridge in silence, the morning light cutting sharp and clear through the trees. Willa watched the landscape roll by, each mile carrying her closer to the life she had left behind. And yet, everything felt different. The woman driving that truck was not the same one who had followed her dog into the woods days ago. She was no longer hiding, no longer patching up the broken pieces of other people's lives to distract from the fracture in her own. She was something else now, a witness, a messenger, a keeper of stories that demanded to be heard. And for the first time in years, she felt whole. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sun had climbed high, and the first headlines were already breaking. News alerts buzzed on Red's old radio. Operation Thunderveil exposed, civilian casualties confirmed. Names were being named, documents authenticated, investigations launched. Willa turned the volume down and looked out over the horizon. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only quiet certainty. The truth was finally free. And so, in a way, was she. But deep down, she knew the fight wasn't finished. It was only just beginning. 2 weeks later, the world had changed, though Coyote Ridge, at first glance, had not. The crooked gas station sign still swayed in the wind. The same rusting tractors still sat abandoned along the roadside. The silence between neighbors still clung to the air like morning fog. But for Willa Sinclair, nothing was the same anymore. Operation Thunderveil was no longer a rumor buried beneath redacted reports and classified files. It was front-page news. Across every major network, reporters spoke James Whitmore's name aloud, a name the government had spent 20 years trying to erase. The Denver Tribune had broken the story first, publishing every letter, every tape, every hidden memo. Investigations erupted overnight. Subpoenas followed, careers ended, and for the first time, families of the victims, the civilians caught in the operation's deadly sweep, had names and faces to grieve publicly. The ripple effect spread far beyond headlines. Protests filled the streets of Denver and Washington. Senate hearings were scheduled. Journalists from around the world descended on the story. And through it all, the name Willa Sinclair appeared again and again. Not as a whistleblower, but as the woman who found the car, the letters, and the courage to speak when silence would have been safer. But Willa didn't watch the coverage. She didn't stand in front of cameras or give interviews. She was back where she belonged, in her garage, surrounded by the comforting smell of gasoline and steel. And in the center bay, beneath the warm light of an early autumn morning, sat the Shelby GT 500. It was no longer a ghost of its former self. The rust was gone. The paint, a deep, soft green James had once called ghost pine, gleamed like polished glass. The chrome caught the light in bright, defiant streaks. Every dent, every scar had been smoothed away, not to erase the car's story, but to honor it. Willa didn't plan to drive it. That wasn't the point. This restoration wasn't about horsepower or mechanics. It was about memory, about promise, about finishing something that had been left undone. She pulled a folding chair into the sunlight, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set one in the empty chair beside her. "For you," she whispered, "for James, for Anna, for Ben." for every truth that had ever been buried too deep. She sat there for a long while, listening to the wind. It carried with it the faint hum of the highway and the distant bark of a dog. But beneath those ordinary sounds, there was something else. Peace. A kind she hadn't felt in years. Just after noon, the sound of tires on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. A rental car rolled to a stop outside the garage, and a woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, slender, with silver hair tied back in a loose braid. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as if unsure whether she belonged here. "Willa Sinclair?" the woman asked. "Yes." "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said. "James was my brother." Willa's heart tightened. "I'm honored to meet you." Margaret smiled faintly. "I received the recordings through the Tribune, and, with them, your name. I had to come." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thin, weathered envelope. "James wrote this before he deployed. It was meant for Anna, but it was returned unopened. She couldn't bear to read it after he died. I found it after she passed last year." Willa took the envelope with reverence, as if it might crumble under her fingers. "I think," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling, "that if James could see what you did, what you risked, he would want you to have this." Willa swallowed hard. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Margaret whispered. "That's why it matters." They sat together for a long time, two women bound by grief and courage and a story that refused to be forgotten. Before Margaret left, she turned back to look at the Shelby. Her eyes softened. "It's funny," she said. "He always promised Anna he'd paint it that exact shade of green. Said it reminded him of the pines back home. Took him months to mix it just right." Willa smiled. "It suits him." After Margaret drove away, Willa carried the letter into her office. She unfolded it slowly, the fragile paper crackling under her fingers. It was short, simple, and heartbreakingly beautiful. "If you're reading this, it means I never made it home. But maybe, just maybe, someone carried me the rest of the way. Whoever you are, thank you for finishing what I couldn't." Willa closed her eyes and held the letter against her chest. She didn't cry. She simply breathed, because in that moment she understood. This story had never truly belonged to her. It had belonged to James and Anna, to the villagers who were silenced, to every person whose truth had been buried. She had simply carried it forward. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the Shelby's glove compartment. The final piece of the puzzle returning home. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline and painted the garage in gold, Willa stood in the doorway and looked at the car one last time. It wasn't just a restored vehicle anymore. It was a monument. To courage, to love, to truth. The world outside was changing. Investigations were expanding. New whistleblowers were stepping forward. Laws were being rewritten. And Willa knew this was only the beginning. But for her, the journey was complete. She had gone into the woods chasing a mystery and emerged carrying a legacy. She turned off the lights, locked the garage, and walked toward her truck with Max trotting faithfully at her side. The night was cool, the stars sharp and bright above. And for the first time in 12 years, Willa didn't feel like she was running from anything. She was moving toward something, a new chapter, a new purpose. Because for Willa Sinclair, truth was no longer a burden to bear. It was a legacy to protect, and as long as there were stories waiting to be uncovered, she knew she would be ready. And somewhere, beneath the quiet hum of the night, the Shelby gleamed under the moonlight. Not as a symbol of what was lost, but as a promise of what could still be found. The car that carried a man's final words had become something far greater, a testament to the power of one voice, one act of courage, and one woman's refusal to let silence win. The mechanic, who once fixed broken things in solitude, had become a guardian of truth, and that truth would live on long after the last engine stopped turning. One woman, one hidden story, and one voice that refused to be silenced. Willa proved that even a single act of courage can change everything. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who believes in the power of truth. And don't go anywhere. The next story is even more powerful. Click now and keep watching.